Hello. Welcome back to the 20th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, disinformation and misinformation stories. It's about the way modern politics is often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with dramatic and emotive subjects instead of the real issues. It's about small things blown up to upset and distract people, made-up causes and astroturf organizations, meaning grassroots organizations, in quotes, invented actually by PRs and lobbyists. And it's named after the American fake grass brand. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening and not happening because it's made up. And then, if we can, we'll ask some vital questions, a bit of lifestyle and shopping and stuff like that. Michael Crick is a political journalist and author of a good many books. I haven't counted them properly, but a good many books. He's been working for mainstream TV news and politics organizations since he joined ITN as a trainee in 1980. Remember, for younger listeners, ITN is the organization which supplies the news programs to ITV, Channel 4, and Channel 5. They develop long-term teams and approaches for their client platforms, and they're the largest news group in the UK commercial sector. Michael was a founding member of the Channel 4 news team back in 1982. He went to Washington as Channel 4's correspondent from 88 to 90. And his first book was a study of the militant tendency. Again, for younger listeners, this is Britain's forgotten ultra-lefties in 1984. And then the following year, one about Arthur Scargill and the miners. He was tackling very hot issues in a hot place. Channel 4 News was said to be much sharper and younger than its BBC rivals. Michael Crick seems to have been a winner absolutely forever, a straight-A student with an Oxford first in that most politically useful course, PPE, editor of Chilwell, even a president of the Union. After 10 years and Channel 4, he joined the BBC, starting with Panorama, then became a regular on Newsnight. Then he wrote an unauthorized biography of Jeffrey Archer, which suggested that Mr. Archer really was a bit of a fibber. Then he wrote the biography of a football celebrity called Sir Alex Ferguson, which came out in 2002 and was widely admired. I have to say, I know nothing of this side of life, so we probably won't talk about it. And in 2005, before the election, a biography of the then Tory leader, Michael Howard. Do you remember him? All the time, he was building a reputation as the bold, investigative journalist who might turn up on your doorstep or run after you in the street if you were a politician. Some of the old clips of him doing just that are very funny. Anyway, he became Newsnight political editor when it was twice as long and a power in the land. And then, in 2011, he went back to Channel 4, later explaining that in his final BBC year, and this is final BBC year of 19, they wanted to stop him being political editor and they wanted him to do something else, rather vague, and he wasn't keen on that. He did a lot more investigation back at C4, including the Andrew Mitchell Plebgate one. We can come to that, but I found that very, very fascinating, slightly knowing Andrew Mitchell, whether he'd say things like that or not. Before leaving ITN in 2019 for a different kind of life, he was done with being a regular political reporter for one set of people, a new life with a variety of things to do, and book writing among them. Since then, he's appeared on GB News, accusing them of right-wing bias, Channel 4 of left-wing bias, and Ofcom of being one of the weakest institutions on the planet. He's got a turn of phrase. Then he was removed from the GB News studio. Oh, and he's written the definitive, the only grown-up one, biography of Nigel Farage, which is pretty interesting. given their current position in the polls. Michael Crick, thank you for joining my Culture Wars house party. You've done 45 years before the mast in TV now, TV news and current affairs in the two major suppliers, the BBC and ITN. And in the course of that time, there's been a major revolution in the way people get their news and in public attitudes to politicians and to reporters for that matter. How have things changed since you were a boy trainee back in 1980?
Well, they've changed hugely, and I think largely for the better, although there are severe downsides as well. I think that when I started out in television back in 1980, we were too reliant on just sort of recycling what other people had told us, mainly what the Press Association had told us for domestic news and what AP and Reuters had told us for international news. There was there's much less of a sort of urgency to find out for ourselves, to add to the story, to investigate, to dig away. And that, I think, began really properly in certainly television news, not current affairs, with longer programmes like Panorama had long existed and World in Action. But I think the advent of, first of all, Newsnight in 1980, at the very start of night, only a few weeks after I actually joined television myself, although I was on the other side working for ITN. And then in 1982, Channel 4 News, which I was involved with, and we sort of did a lot more background. We tried to explain why things were happening and to look at what might happen next and what people thought and why they were doing this and all of that. And it became much more intelligent news gathering and news explanation. And I think a huge improvement. Now, at the same time, there's a lot less regional broadcasting than there used to be. The regional and daily newspapers have sort of gone, out of business on a huge scale. But I think overall, British journalism is, I'm an optimistic person. I think we are doing our job of holding people in power in the widest sense to account. We're doing that better than we used to. There's still all sorts of wrongdoing going on and corruption and terrible things. But, part of the job is not just to expose what people are up to, but to keep them on their toes, to deter them from doing what they might be tempted to do. And it's tricky, and there's huge pressures, particularly on the BBC right now, which I'm extremely worried about. But I do think British journalism is stronger now than it was in 1980. And not just because I've been working for it for the last 45 years.
So things have got better. They've got deeper digs. They've got a mission to explain. But is that universal? That was pioneered, you're saying, by Channel 4, ITN for Channel 4 and that team. But did it really go out to the rest of the news world? When was Sky News started?
That started at around about 1988, 89. In fact, I remember questioning Murdoch when he launched it at his press conference. And it was called Sky in those days. And then there was another satellite channel, and then called British Satellite Broadcasting, and they merged.
Sky B. Yeah.
Yeah. And they merged. And I remember asking Murdoch whether journalistic standards on his new channel, his new satellite channel, would be the same as some of his newspapers like The Sun and the News of the World, with lies and fabricated stories and invasions of privacy. And the room was shocked, and Murdoch was shocked. It took him quite a while to come up with an answer. I can't remember what the answer was. It wasn't very informative, but at least he'd been asked. And actually, to be fair, Sky was not like that. Sky is a good channel as well, and has much of the spirit of ITN about it. But I wouldn't just say it was Channel 4 News that made advances in this area. If you take even the BBC 10 o'clock news, much of it is very pedestrian and predictable. But there are some wonderful investigative type films on the 10 o'clock news from the BBC these days that you would never get in 1980 or 1990 for that matter. For one, Ed Thomas has done an amazing series about crime on the high streets of many smaller towns in this country, and places like Grimsby and Newport, I think, was one of them. A real eye-opener to what's going on at the local level. And that's what we're supposed to do. And, there are a lot of failings, and I have strong opinions about some of them. But I think overall, things are better off. I think the real serious decline, though, is in local journalism and regional journalism, particularly local newspapers, because local newspapers and the possibility that you might be in the local rag next week because of something naughty you've done on the council, or maybe something that you've been up in court for, I think actually played quite an important role in the community and keeping things together.
What did you think your job was once you became an on-screen reporter, investigator? What were you there for?
Well, in a lot of cases, let's be frank about this, it was the daily output of news that you were having to report, you were having to relay what's been going on today to the nation. And often it was quite tricky because there was a big story and it would go on 4 or 5 days. And when you got to day 3, 4 or 5, you frankly couldn't think of much new to say to add to the story or new people to talk to. The amount of time over those years that I spent digging at long-term stories was, well under 50%, I'd say, even though it's probably the more memorable stuff. And so even I didn't get the time that is needed. And I think one of the problems that journalists have today, there are a lot fewer of us, there are a lot fewer broadcasters, is that in the old days, you would be given more time than they get now. I mean, take my old colleague John Ware on Panorama, a brilliant investigative reporter, although he's not as well known in my view as he should be. I mean, he would spend more than a year often on one programme getting to the bottom of state killings, frankly, killings by the security forces in Northern Ireland, and digging away and getting people to talk and finding the documents. And nowadays, he wouldn't have that freedom, I don't think. I don't think anybody could afford to have a reporter, a well-paid reporter, working away that long, because there's always the possibility the reporter will come back after 3 months or 6 months and say, actually, I'm not sure we can make this story work, or I'm not 100% convinced that there is something going on here. And you need that freedom to fail. And that freedom to fail only happens if the journalistic outputs are well funded. And sadly, there's less advertising around these days, both in television and in newspapers. And so journalists don't get that freedom to fail, the time to dig away. But there are all sorts of other advantages that we do have that sort of compensate for that.
So things got a lot better through the 80s and part of the 90s, but now it's a matter of funding. Is it only a matter of funding, or have people become much more cautious?
I still think things are better now than they were in 1980 for other reasons. I mean, for instance, we have freedom of information. We can apply to any state body for background documents on what's gone on. I mean, you have to be persistent because they'll come back initially and come up with some excuse as to why they can't. And then you have to say, no, but that excuse isn't adequate and so on. Or you might even have to appeal. But you do have that. That's an example. Or take the advent of social media has lots of disadvantages. But what it does mean is that you can appeal for information. For example, one of the things that I do, it's a big part of my life on and off right now, is I do a Twitter feed called @TomorrowsMPs, which is all about the selection of parliamentary candidates, which you might think is a pretty boring subject, but it's absolutely vital because who becomes parliamentary candidates then determines who becomes our MPs and who becomes our ministers. And the quality of those people and the type of people and whether they're honest and decent people is really important. And much of the selection of parliamentary candidates in the past has gone on totally unobserved. And of course, it's even less observed now because it's not in local newspapers, because in many places there aren't any, or the ones that still exist aren't interested. And what I often do, and I've been doing it in the last few days, is I will go onto my Twitter feed and say, well, I've found out that such and such is a contender here, and so is so and somebody else, but there must be others. Please DM me, send me a direct message. And people do. They send me messages as to what's going on in their local Liberal Democrat association, as it is at the moment, because the other parties aren't selecting yet. But later on, it will be the other parties. And I get an absolute wealth of information, not just about who's standing, but all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. Now, I have to be careful. Some of this may be wrong. I may be a victim of a hoax. But it is a way of finding out what's going on that we couldn't even have conceived of 40 years ago. And that is an improvement in journalism. And in fact, the whole advent of social media has many drawbacks, and it may do a lot of harm to our political discourse in some ways, but it does mean that there is a lot more information out there. And if you're writing a book about a contemporary person, it makes life almost impossible. You're just overwhelmed with stuff. That was certainly the case when I wrote a book about Farage. But it's an improvement in a way that there is so much material around.
But you have to edit.
Yes.
And it's quite a fat book, your book on Nigel Farage. I think it's fair to say.
Some people say too fat. And that I should have slimmed it down.
There's a lot of stuff in it.
And indeed,
I think there's a lot of stuff in it. So, amongst other things, you are the sort of Andrew Roth de nos jours.
Well, it's nice.
Do you remember Andrew Roth?
I certainly do remember Andrew Roth, and I knew him not very well, but I went to his house a few times, and he lived up in Cricklewood in North London.
Yes.
And you went to his house, and it was absolutely crammed with brown envelopes on every member of Parliament, or everybody who had been a member of Parliament. And not just, he would cut up their contributions in the House of Commons and put them in this envelope from the newspaper reports, which we used to have in those days. There would be a page in the serious newspapers of yesterday in Parliament, but he would also put in anything to do with their financial affairs that he found out. Absolute wealth of material. And by the way, that all those archives still exist for the MPs that were around in Andrew's day, and he died, I suppose, about 20, 25 years ago, and they're all in the Bishopsgate Centre in the City of London, a wonderful archive for anybody doing any historical political research.
That's nice to know. Very nice to know.
There is also there a new archive of diaries. I think they've got 20,000 or something so far. And these are not just diaries of famous people and influential people, or published diaries. These are unpublished diaries, and they're the diaries of ordinary people as well. And so one day it will be possible to say, right, June the 19th, 1906, what was everybody thinking? And you'll be able to compare what cabinet ministers were thinking with what ordinary folk in Grimsby were thinking.
Like mass observation during the war.
Exactly.
Now, you moved house, so to speak, because there you were, an ITN trainee, and then into Channel 4 doing all this modern stuff, and then you moved to the BBC. What differences struck you when you first moved to the BBC?
Well, in some ways, they are quite similar. They were both bureaucratic organisations. The idea that somehow because ITN is a commercial company and so on, and therefore would be much more efficient, is myth. It certainly wasn't in those days, in the 1980s, and there was a lot of corruption in ITN, frankly, expense fiddling, and in the BBC in the 1980s, all of which was in private eye. But I think the main difference I would sum up would be ITN always had a can-do attitude. So if some story broke an hour before the bulletin, or half an hour before the bulletin, we'd say, oh, right, we can get together a film in 30 minutes or an hour. It may not be very long, and it may miss things out, but we'll do everything we possibly can in that time. Whereas the BBC attitude would be, oh dear, I'm not sure we've got time to do that. We'll just sort of have to, mention it read out by the newsreader or something. When I was on Newsnight in the 90s and the noughties, it always astonished me that we had a team of about 12 reporters. But most of us were allowed to go home at 6 o'clock unless we were doing something for the programme that night. But nobody seemed to think, well, what about if a news story breaks after everybody's gone home that needs another reporter? Oh, well, there aren't any, so we can't really do it properly. ITN always had an attitude, of course we'll do it, we can do it, and we can do it better than the other lot. And they often did stories with fewer people and less money than the BBC. And that attitude, I think, went into Sky, it went into Channel 4 News, and we still have it to a degree today, but not like the ITN I joined in the 1980s.
But you, after your move, you were at the BBC for 19 years, and you've described it as being 18 of those years being really quite happy.
I think it was 21, actually.
And then something went wrong.
And, well, basically, I think they decided that I wasn't doing the job of political editor of Newsnight in the way they'd like, and I wasn't breaking enough stories and coming up on screen and saying, well, when I was talking to cabinet ministers today and all of that, and maybe I wasn't as good at doing the sort of Westminster side in being a member of the lobby and all of that. So I think actually it did me good leaving Newsnight at that point and going back to Channel 4 News and having a new lease of life and getting stuck into other stories and allowing Gary Gibbon, who was political editor of Channel 4 News, while I was only the political correspondent. So Gary would do the big main political stories and I would go and find other political stories to do. And I think perhaps I'd spent too long in some of these places on reflection, and I should have moved about a bit. And my real regret is I never really went into any kind of management. I never really ran anything in my professional career, which is a pity because I think I would have not been bad at it, especially having, as you said, I was at Oxford. I edited the newspaper. I was president of the union, and I also founded a few things when I was at Oxford. And that side of me, the management, getting things done, pioneering and so on, I think I neglected in my 45 years in television and journalism. And it means today that when I apply to serve on boards, people look at my CV and they think, well, what does he know about running anything? Which is true. What do I know about running a university, say, or whatever board I've applied to? But I did have something in me that would have enabled me to do that. And I should have danced around a bit more and done a greater variety of jobs. But it's too late now, really. And I'm having a very happy life doing this and that and doing lots of journalism, some paid and some unpaid.
Despite your straight A background, absolutely.
Well, actually, that's not quite true. I only got ABC at A level. But that didn't matter in those days. People didn't really worry about that sort of thing so much.
We won't compare competitive educational misery here because I could come in bigly on that. I would call, despite your straight A background, in some ways, you were not conventionally ambitious. You didn't want to be head of, chair of, manage, CEO of. You wanted to do the work.
Well,
and do the investigations and the amusing doorstops and runnings after. That you prefer doing that, essentially, or that's how you voted with your feet, which a lot of people would find very admirable.
Well, I did, and I neglected, the management side. I neglected the possibility of setting up businesses of my own, which I had done when I was at Oxford and very young. And because, frankly, the journalism that I was doing, I just loved it, and it was fun. I mean, there were boring days. There were boring days, and there were days when you struggled to do anything different from what you'd done the day before. But it was so enjoyable, and I went to places. I travelled mostly around Britain, but I did in my earlier journalistic career travel abroad a lot. And you had a front row seat at the political stage, either the British political stage or the world political stage. You were talking to people in power, going out to lunch with them, and you felt, almost part of it. Although part of me says, supposing I'd gone into politics. That was also the other option when I was a teenager and through my 20s. That was always the intention, to go into politics. The trouble is, it's difficult to make the jump from being broadcasting, where you're meant to be neutral and impartial and not party committed, into politics. And so I just kept putting it off and it never happened. But it is one of the most enjoyable careers.
And who would you have been a candidate for?
Well,
who would you have joined?
In those days, the Labour Party. I mean, I left the Labour Party 25 years ago. And nowadays, if I was a candidate, if somebody said, "Oh, well, we'll put you in the House of Lords," I think I would probably be an independent or, a crossbencher, or maybe a Liberal Democrat. But I think the Labour Party has become far too authoritarian. I left them in 2000 because I thought it was wrong for a broadcaster who was covering politics to belong to a political party. But I wouldn't rejoin them now because I think they're too authoritarian. And that is what I observed in the years before the last general election. Starmer and his acolytes and his team did some terrible things, purging people from the candidates list. And I think that for a political party to operate well, it's got to have a variety of people with a variety of views. Otherwise, you don't get any challenge. And yet, in a way, I was wrong, because now the Labour Party is getting a huge amount of challenge from within its own ranks over all sorts of issues. And, the latest being these proposals on tightening up on asylum seekers. But the left is almost disappeared within the Labour Party. Not that I regarded myself as being on the left, but I'm a pluralist at heart. I believe that every voice should be heard. And often people, I've always traditionally regarded myself as right-wing Labour, but I always felt that, if you have somebody on the left saying, but why don't we do it this way? Their ideas may well be worth trying. And I think it's interesting that past Labour prime ministers, Attlee and Wilson and Blair, they always had a good sprinkling of intelligent left-wingers in their cabinets. Nye Bevan and Tony Benn and Michael Foot and Barbara Castle and Richard Crossman and so on. And later on, people like Claire Short and Robin Cook. And that actually improves government. And a strong prime minister shouldn't be frightened of having people who challenge him within his or her cabinet.
And it just makes the whole mix of the brand, I hate to use this ghastly marketing speak word, but the whole mix of the brand much livelier, and the result of iron discipline on your party makes a party that's very boring to watch, I think, wherever it's applied.
Boring to watch, and people don't like being disciplined. And eventually, when they get so fed up and they realise they're never going to get a ministerial job, and they realise that if things carry on like this, I'm going to lose my seat at the next election and have only been an MP for one term, that is what is generating the increasing revolts that are taking place, even though Labour, in theory, has an extraordinarily high majority. So they should have seen this coming. Well, Starmer wouldn't have seen it coming because he's not a political creature. He only went into politics about 10 years ago, really, when he stopped being DPP. But the people around him should have known this. But the trouble with the Starmer regime is the calibre of the people is not that high. I mean, a lot of these people who are in the cabinet would only have been Minister of State, or maybe not even that, under people like Wilson and Blair. And fortunately, there are good people who were elected in 2024, and it will take a while before they percolate through and reach the very highest offices. But some of these jobs are really hard to do, and you do need clever people. I think one of the problems is that politics, and this applies to all the parties, is infected by this view that all our MPs should be local. You've got to have been born there or lived there or worked there to understand the problems of that constituency. And that's a complete load of rubbish. Whatever your politics, if you ask yourself, who are my political heroes? And then you say, well, how many of them were local to the constituency they represented? You'll say a minority. I mean, Churchill wasn't local to the very seats he represented. Thatcher wasn't. Tony Benn wasn't. I mean, and yet people recognise these were good politicians, statesmen in their different ways. You may disagree with their politics. And by insisting that all our MPs be local, we end up with people who are, may well be good local councillors, but that doesn't mean they're going to be good MPs or good ministers.
Another change about politics internationally and potentially for us is money. Seriously big money in politics. There's enormous money in American politics. Has been for some time, but now even more. How does that work out here when somebody like Elon Musk is saying, I'll give the Reform Party $100 million, and then he forgets about it? But they're in the considerations.
Well,
has money had an influence on British politics recently?
Yes and no. I don't think it's anything like as bad as on the American scale. And there are official state limits to how much candidates can spend in a constituency or how much parties can spend in an election or in the year running up to an election. It's difficult to police these limits, and it's easy for parties to cheat.
Yeah.
And also you've got the problem that some parties are richer than others. I mean, traditionally, the Conservatives were the wealthy party, and Labour didn't have anything like the same amount of money and was much more dependent on trade unions for contributions rather than businesses or individuals. That's all become a bit more complicated these days. And also there are other issues like the role of lobbyists and money in that respect and so on. But I don't think money is our greatest problem in politics right now, because the sums that are spent on fighting elections are tiny compared with what the Americans do. And also, occasionally, you often see parties that spend huge sums of money or candidates that spend huge sums of money and they still don't get elected. I mean, look at the referendum party. It's a long time ago now. Back in 1997, Jimmy Goldsmith spent about £40 million and got nowhere. He didn't get a single MP. So it doesn't always, money doesn't always translate into votes. But we have to be vigilant, and we have to be vigilant in particular about how our politicians and their parties spend money on social media, because that is very difficult to police. How many Facebook pages are seen by the general public and how much they cost to make and all of that. Almost impossible to police, quite frankly.
I ask myself constantly, why do people believe the extraordinary things they do, given what we're supposed to have heard and read and the various regulations on what we've heard and read? Or is it that things which aren't regulated, aren't widely observed, are becoming huge bases of disinformation?
Well, there is a lot of disinformation around, and what terrifies me is that in 5 or 10 years with AI, you will be able to ruin a party's campaign or a candidate's chances by perhaps revealing fake pictures generated by AI of, say, a candidate, having sex with a lion or whatever, or accepting a brown envelope from some dodgy character, and that this will be put out on social media 2 or 3 days before the election, so they haven't got a chance to reply, they haven't had a chance to expose this material is totally fake and bogus, and that their chances are ruined and that their opponent gets elected. And, it's getting harder and harder to tell what is fake and what is genuine. And we've already seen, in fact, there's a brilliant book written by a guy, I think it's called Brian Klass, Klass, and I think it's called something like How to Fix an Election. Now, that came out about 10 years ago, and that was already talking about how you can introduce false players, really, bots and all of that, into elections. And we feared it had happened in the 2016 presidential election with the Russians and so on,
yeah.
Although nothing was really proved about that. But what Klass and his co-author show in that book is how in the developing world, where people's understanding of politics is maybe less sophisticated, it has been possible to put out damaging stories about senior politicians, and they've been totally unable to respond, and they've ended up losing. And you can see a world like that. I've often thought, for example, in this country, it would be quite easy for the Chinese or the Russians to infiltrate our political parties, particularly as so often decisions are made by political parties when they select candidates, for example, by, they just create fake members. And then they would elect their sympathetic characters as their candidates, and then their MPs. They could cause huge damage, especially if they did it, over the long term, and they sort of started investing. I mean, I shouldn't be saying this now. I'd be giving them ideas, but I'm sure these are ideas they've already thought about. And while parties, have low memberships in many cases, they're more and more susceptible to that kind of infiltration, in much the same way that the Labour Party, as I was writing about 40 years ago, was susceptible to infiltration from the Trotskyite left. But at least those Trotskyites did exist,
yes.
And they weren't doing it on behalf of a foreign power.
And they were called the militant tendencies.
Indeed. I mean, another thing is, for instance, in leadership elections, conservativehome.com frequently do polls of their subscribers and asking them which of the candidates that they would prefer. And then when they, maybe a few hundred subscribers write in or do a survey and they say, well, we prefer X or Y, that then creates momentum within that party for that particular candidate. Now, it would be perfectly possible for the Russians or the Chinese to subscribe another few thousand subscribers to not just Conservative Home or Labour List, which is the sort of Labour equivalent. And so therefore, the outcome of such surveys, which are often very unscientific, would be totally skewed but on behalf of some malign foreign power in order to have the party leader and the prime minister that was most favourable to that foreign power, the Russians or the Chinese, which, of course, is what we all thought happened in 2016 and may have happened in 2016 and 2024 with Donald Trump. But you try and prove it. That's the problem.
I think with that huge range of investigations, what was clear was that the Russians had persistently lobbied online for Trump using a variety of methods, a variety of culture wars, insinuations, all that stuff. What they never proved was that Trump was himself a party to this, that there was conspiracy, any of that stuff remained unproven, but there were some fascinating stories around then. And there are some fascinating stories around now.
Yes, and we've seen in Europe that the Russians have funded at least one German politician. There were Russian funds that flowed to Marine Le Pen. We've seen the way that they've clearly interfered in the election of places like Georgia, Romania, and we've also seen very close to home, and in fact in a few days' time, he will almost certainly be jailed, Nathan Gill, a former who was a member of the European Parliament for both UKIP, Nigel Farage's former party, and then a member of the European Parliament for the Brexit Party, which later became Reform UK. Nathan Gill has already been convicted, I think it's 8 charges, of taking bribes to make statements favourable to the Russian side in the dispute over Ukraine. While he was in the European Parliament, some of these statements were in the media, some of them were in the Parliament itself. Now, that is an example of, what that may be going on a much wider scale. And now quite how you police that, it's very, very difficult. I'm astonished that the Nathan Gill story hasn't had more coverage, because he was actually convicted about 6 weeks ago, and he had pleaded guilty.
Why do you think it had so little coverage?
Well, I think it was partly because it happened in a week when there was a lot of the news going on. But I suppose it's because nobody's ever heard of Nathan Gill, although he was he was very, very close to Farage. I mean, did Farage's work within the UKIP group within the European Parliament towards the end of our membership of the European Union and the European Parliament. Farage couldn't be bothered running the party and his MEPs there anymore, and he basically delegated all of that work to Nathan Gill. Nathan Gill, interestingly, when Farage left UKIP and founded the Brexit Party in 2018 to 2019, he only took 2 of his UKIP MEPs with him to the new party. Yep. He promised lots of them they could be Brexit Party candidates, having been UKIP MEPs, but only 2 of them did he take with him, and Nathan Gill was one of them. So that is a sign of how close they were. And it's interesting that when Nathan Gill was convicted, although he's yet to be sentenced in a couple of weeks' time, it's interesting that Farage disappeared for a week or two, clearly because he faced that embarrassing question of how close he was to Gill, and it was very close.
How do you feel about the BBC crisis?
Well,
I think it's fair to call it a crisis. Do you think it's fair?
It is a crisis, undoubtedly. It's one of the worst crises, if not the worst crisis, that the BBC has had. Because we've not just seen the Director General go, but the Head of News and Current Affairs, Deborah Turness. And they face this legal action by Trump. Now, the Trump legal action will almost certainly fail because it's very difficult to find any evidence that it actually did any harm to Trump. In fact, on the contrary, I would say it was quite good for Trump because all this fuss we've had for the last 2 weeks has actually shown that Trump didn't say, now go along to Capitol Hill and, be violent and attack people. But nonetheless, I think that on the one hand, the BBC has to be defended. There are malign forces amongst other media outlets, be they newspapers or television channels, and there are malign forces in politics who would like to see the BBC completely destroyed. Yep. And that would be disastrous. I mean, the BBC is one of the few things we have in this country which helps hold us together, that creates a certain unity in society and brings people together when there are popular shows like Strictly Come Dancing and Traitors and so on. And the idea of Britain without the BBC is horrendous from my point of view. I mean, there is such a variety. We just forget how much variety there is in the things that the BBC does. And it is recognised around the world for the quality of its output and for being trustworthy. However, I do think, and I think this very strongly, that the BBC is in danger of losing a substantial chunk of the population, because I think that, I'm a liberal, right? I'm slightly left of centre, and I have a liberal outlet. I'm university educated, and I'm a liberal in the sort of progressive left-wing sense. And I think that nearly everybody who works in the BBC comes from a similar background. And we live in the southeast. We're reasonably well off. We went to university. We went to good schools in many cases, and we have a certain view. The danger is in our society right now is we are falling into two camps. The other group of people who feel that they're not doing very well at the moment, that this country is not providing them with a job and a future and an affordable home or affordable rents. And those are the people, tens of millions of people who voted for Brexit, many of them, or who vote for Reform UK. The danger is that if there are millions of people out there who feel the BBC is not for them or it's no longer for them, then they're not going to pay the licence fee anymore. And it's very easy to get away with not paying the licence fee. Let's be frank about it. And if people don't pay the licence fee, the BBC is going to lose income and it's not going to be able to do all the wonderful output that it does. So the BBC needs to address this problem quickly. And I do think that actually under Tim Davie, they were addressing it. But it needs to understand that there are people with generally working class backgrounds from the north of England, but not entirely, but people who, the real dividing line is whether people went to university or not, actually, much of this. And you can't leave them out of it. And the BBC has to provide for them and bring them back on board and make them believe that paying £174.50 every year is well worth it. I mean, it's easy for people like you and me. That is an easy sum to pay. But for people who haven't got much money, who haven't got a job or much prospect of a job and so on, that is a large sum of money. And to expect people to pay that when they don't watch it much or don't listen to it much, well, you can see the long-term dangers. So that's how I see the situation.
What about the standards applied and the decisions that were made about that Panorama programme? Trump has presented it as fake news. Was it really fake news?
It was a grave error. And I suppose for 12 seconds, yes, it was fake news. Those two parts of the speech were 55 or 54 minutes apart in the speech, and they were presented as being a continuous part of the speech, and that was wrong. But nobody can really understand how this error took place and why nobody spotted it. It is really baffling, and I've spoken to lots of colleagues and former colleagues and friends about this, and nobody can really explain it. I suppose it may have happened by somebody who said, well, it's perfectly legitimate to use that bit of the quote from there and that bit of the quote from there, because we all know that that's what Trump intended. Yep. He intended that his supporters should go and storm the Capitol. But you can't go round editing things on the basis of what we all know. And in any case, we don't all know. So I think it was really wrong. It was bad. And I'm astonished nobody picked it up. There may have been one or two people at a fairly low level who did it on this what we all know basis. And that the higher-ups, the people who are meant to keep an eye on these things, the executive producers, they were diverted or they didn't think properly. But I like to think that if I'd been executive producer on that programme, I would have thought, crikey, did Trump really say all that in one go? Well, why have I not seen that quotation before? Especially given the criminal legal action against him, which was going on in America at that time. Very serious action, accusing him of trying to overturn the election through violence and through goading his supporters into doing that. Then it is very surprising that it occurred. And although I do think there is a cultural liberal bias through much of the BBC's output, I don't think it actually affects 99% of the news output and the news and current affairs output. And often it's more in things like comedy programmes and arts programmes. But you and I would no doubt disagree on this, but there we are.
Three things about that BBC crisis. One, there is a fairly long history of Trump appearing to incite violence. So he will say things back in the days of the great gatherings of 2016, etc. He would say, give him a thorough bashing up, I'll pay the court fees. Roughly, this is allegedly and roughly what he said to crowds. And he seems to be quite fond of saying things like that. The second thing, of course, about Trump is he doesn't half go on. So he will do well over an hour's ramble in which there'll be diversions and non-sex and etc. And if you were aiming to put that thing together, which of course is a commonplace thing in non-political documentaries, I would suggest, you might do that. And then, of course, the third thing is that it was made outside.
Yes, and the latter, I think, is a problem. I think there is, and I've discussed this at length with a very close friend who's been involved in this process of commissioning outside independents and also working for outside independents later on. And there is a danger of something falling between the cracks.
Yeah.
And the problem you often have with independents is that they sometimes exaggerate what they've got, what they've managed to film or find out. And also, if they make a grave error, they're a bit reluctant to admit it to the BBC because the danger is they won't get any BBC contracts ever again. And this may turn out to be a huge amount of their income, if not their total income. So that problem can exist. But we can't just go around saying, well, it's the sort of thing that Trump, has sort of said on other occasions. That's a bit like saying, well, I know you didn't commit this burglary, but we know you've committed 500 burglaries in this area. This is the one that we're doing you for, even though we know you didn't do it. That is the road to, it's corrupt, frankly. And I'm not saying that using this... I don't think I'd use that word corrupt about this particular incident. It was certainly very, very wrong. And of course, but the BBC has got to stand up to Trump. There's no way they should be paying money to Trump. And I think they should be seriously looking at the possibility of countersuing Trump for saying that their journalists are corrupt. Actually, he's been very defamatory towards BBC journalists. And my view is the best way to deal with a bully is to stand up to him or her.
Yeah. There's another part of the story, isn't there, which is running in parallel. The question of, standards, whether it was a systemic problem or management problem. But there's another story, which is that the response to it and the dissemination of it was cooked up by a fifth column inside the BBC involving a notable Conservative on their board.
Well, yes, it's difficult, this, because Robbie Gibb is a friend of mine. He used to be a colleague and deputy editor when I was on Newsnight. And I've been to parties at his house, often parties involving quite a few of the other players in this drama. Robbie has long been concerned about liberal or left-wing bias on output within the BBC. And he was very keen to join the BBC board. Indeed, he was involved in the early days within GB News, and he gave up that role in GB News in order to apply to be a trustee of the BBC. Now, there's people saying, well, we shouldn't be having political people on the board of the BBC. And I have some sympathy with that. The only thing is that there have always been political people on the board of the BBC, and often the chairman has had either a strong Labour background or a strong Conservative background. So if you're going to get rid of him, you should be getting rid of all of them. And I think actually in this case, Robbie, I haven't spoken to him about it, but I think in this case, his friends are saying that he is a supporter of Tim Davie and was sad to see him go. And I think he, as a board member, I've served on boards in other contexts. As a board member, if you think that something's going wrong in an organisation, it's your duty to say so. Now, I mean, he was only one of, 13 members of the board. And I don't think there's no evidence, for instance, that Robbie Gibb leaked this outside report by a man called Michael Prescott. So I think
somebody did.
Well, it may have been Mr. Prescott. I don't know. He's been very silent.
Who is a friend of Sir Robbie.
That's right. And there are friendships. And then there's also a former colleague of mine, David Grossman, who now works in editorial standards within the BBC. And I know, and David too has long been concerned about liberal bias that he perceives and I perceive in the BBC. But the idea it's a sort of political conspiracy to help the Conservative Party or help reform, I don't think that's true. But I do think that those people, like me, and I'm certainly not in on any conspiracy, we are concerned about the way things, about the output. Indeed, former Directors General like Mark Thompson has said, I think, that in the past the BBC, for instance, never addressed the issue of immigration. And I think he also said, or it may be the other way around. Anyway, the other issue that I think the BBC never properly addressed until the referendum came upon us 10 years ago is the whole question of our membership of the European Union. So, but things I think have been going in the right direction that way. And so, I don't think it was a conspiracy. It was just like-minded people, perhaps exchanging views privately amongst themselves and saying, well, we've got to change things for the better. And I would defend them on that. Now, they start leaking documents and that sort of thing, that is different, because they're not supposed to do that.
At what point do you leak something to an organisation fantastically opposed to the BBC, fanatically, I would say?
Yeah, the Telegraph.
And in a rather curious situation itself. That, two things. One, Robbie Gibb is not a naturally occurring BBC person. He's not on the executive board. He's a non-executive director placed there by the last Tory government. And there's a long history of him going and doing what no non-executive director in any organisation is supposed to do, is going and lecturing people on the front line. If when I was non-executive director of a company which actually made things, kitchens, I had gone to the Midlands to talk to the production director about how those things should be made, I'd have been out on my ear. If I'd gone to impose my views, I'd have been absolutely, and that would be true for a great many Neds in a great many situations in well-organised companies. You're not supposed to do that. And Emily Maitlis reported him doing exactly that.
Well, if he did, as you say, impose his views, then that is serious. And I wasn't aware of that. But also as a non-executive director, which I've been in a university context for 12 years at Manchester and Kent, you do, if you're doing your job properly, you go around the organisation, you speak to staff, and you find out, you try to get a sense of what the organisation is all about.
Absolutely.
And I think from time to time, and I'm sure you did as well, if you've been a non-executive director, you might say, well, it's interesting you do it. Have you ever thought of doing it that way instead? It may be just a throwaway remark. Now, where you draw the line between friendly advice and imposing, as you put it, is tricky. And particularly when Robbie himself has, spent most of his, I don't know how many years he spent in the BBC, at least 20, possibly 30, and in very senior roles as well. So I would have thought he would be, in those circumstances, more likely to give advice. Now, whether this was friendly advice, maybe it was hostile advice, that is the important dividing line. But how you lay it down is tricky.
It's been reported as hostile.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe I'm being too kind to him then. I need to go away and rethink it. There's an article come out recently by Alan Rusbridger, which I've yet to read, although I did read a previous article that Alan Rusbridger, the former editor of The Guardian, wrote for Prospect magazine. But we'll get back to the fact that this, from the very start, governments and political parties, senior political parties, have had the power to appoint people to the BBC board. And maybe you're right. I think you probably are. Maybe we should just bring that to an end. But then you have the problem of, supposing somebody was a member of the Labour Party 30 years ago, does that make them political? And it gets tricky. But I'm a great believer. Non-executive job directors should be holding the people running the company in a pleasant, courteous manner to account for what they're doing. Otherwise, there's not much point in them. And indeed, I think one of the problems we have with non-executive directors within the state today is that they don't do that job properly. And I think if the non-executive directors, for instance, in the post office have been doing their job and they got paid, complete waste of money in my view, I get very angry about this. If they'd been doing their job properly, then the submasters post office thing would have been a lot less serious. And if they'd read Private Eye every fortnight and said, well, what about this? Now what about, and been persistent. And I think if the non-executive directors in the health service did their job properly, we might have fewer health service scandals. But in my experience of university boards, a lot of non-executive directors just go along, read the papers, ask a few questions, and don't really explore what's going on within their organisations and don't really get to the bottom of their organisation.
It's a finely tuned thing, and you're absolutely right.
It is. It's fascinating. And I think there's actually more work for governments to do more widely on non-executive directors. I know this is a long way from the BBC. I think actually it would be improving the performance of non-executive directors, many of whom are not paid, would be a very good way of cheaply improving the performance of government as a whole.
I wanted to ask you about Nigel Farage. Who is he, and why do voters appear to like him so much?
Well, he's in terms of background, he comes from a sort of, quite a middle-class background. His father was a stockbroker. He himself worked in the city as well as a metals trader, went to a good school, Dulwich College, a private day school in South London. And he is, I think he's genuinely motivated by concern for his country. I don't agree with most of what he says. And I do think he does have remarkable political skills. And I think that's why he has got so far. I mean, he's not very collegiate. He's not a great team player. I think he would be a disaster as Prime Minister. He's never really run anything apart from a small metals trading business of about 3 or 4 people that did okay. But he has remarkable communication skills and an amazing charisma, and he's good at all the different forms of communication. Television, radio, the parliamentary chamber, the big mass meeting, and he's good with people on the street. He likes engaging with people who don't agree with him. A lot of politicians don't actually like talking to the public that much, certainly not on the street. And I think he's also a very effective communicator because of his use of humour. And he's often self-deprecating.
Yeah.
And I think people like that, actually.
Very much unlike Donald Trump.
Exactly. No, yeah. I mean, you can... And so, but he can get very angry, and the rate at which his colleagues fall out with him, the turnover of people who are members of UKIP in the European Parliament, they were always resigning from the party and joining other parties. And we saw the same with the Brexit Party, and now we're seeing the same with Reform UK. So I think a Farage government would be a disaster. And we're already seeing this in local government. All these councils earlier this year, who got elected, lots of Reform councillors, and in some cases, Reform took over the council, and they were telling everybody, oh, it won't be any problem to find lots of things lots of spending we can cut. Well, it now appears they can find hardly any, and that they're going to have to put up everybody's council tax by 5%, which is what other councils of other parties are having to do. So he is a fascinating character and great company. If you go and have lunch with him, it's a proper Farage lunch, then it's a very enjoyable occasion. But I'm particularly concerned about Farage's relationship with Trump and his admiration for Trump, and, well, sycophancy, really. I mean, his attitude towards Trump is what many people feel towards him. And also, he's been very ambivalent about Putin and Ukraine over recent years, and I find that very worrying. I find some of his policies very worrying. His total dismissal of net zero, his desire to abolish all foreign aid. I mean, he's quickly modifying a lot of these policies, of course, but not those two, so far as I'm aware.
Whose interest does reform really represent? Because if you look at the top people in reform, they're all very rich.
Well, they're not all very rich, but...
No, but put aside Lee Anderson, who is there as...
Yeah, this is the great contradiction.
Tokenistic reasons, some people might say.
Well, there's others as well. I mean, Grain Toller, who's a member of their national executive and often appears on screens, is not rich at all. But there are a lot of rich donors, a lot of very wealthy donors to Reform UK, many of whom used to donate to the Conservative Party. And Farage does like the rich high life,
Yes.
He likes going to gentlemen's clubs. He likes going to expensive restaurants. This idea that he's just an ordinary bloke, just a man of the people, well, yes and no. I think many of the people who are wealthy in this country would welcome the idea of a reform government. And I think that many of the poorer people in this country, and they're probably doing better amongst the poorest than any other party right now, will be severely disappointed. I'm not sure, actually, reform is going to do much to improve employment or to boost wages. On the contrary, it'll probably hold down wages.
The very least of things is to say they may be turkeys voting for Christmas in terms of their economic interests, as opposed to the economic interests of the people at the top of reform and the economic interests of the people who give big money to reform. There's that. There's also the question of their proximity to Trump, to right-wing European parties, and to Putin, does suggest that if they were running the country, it does suggest they might follow similar policies to Trump in terms of domestic authoritarianism and similar policies to, let's say, Viktor Orban.
Yes, and remember, Farage, within his own parties, has always been a dictator, and actually more so now than ever. I mean, if you look at the National Executive Committee of the Reform Party, there are 3 members, I think, of the National Executive who are actually elected by the members, and there are 12 members that are effectively appointed by Farage himself. There ain't much democracy in Reform. It's a very centralised party. And the same was true in his previous parties. And if people step out of line, they are purged. Tony Benn always used to say, a very good test of democracy is, what is the process for getting rid of the leader? And there's no clear process for getting rid of the leader in Reform UK. And there was no clear process in the past in his previous parties. And many of the people that have fallen out with Farage have been purged by him and not allowed back. And all sorts of terrible things have befallen them. So he's an admirer of Trump and of Putin. And, of course, that's exactly the way they behave.
Yes.
They are bullies. They purge people. They fall out with people. And accidents then befall those people. And so people like you and me, who are public critics, might find life under a Farage government not very comfortable. I shouldn't be laughing about it, really.
Michael, thank you so much. And you've closed on precisely the issue that everyone's wondering about, whether we should be fearful of a reform government. And you've rather said that we, commentators, you're much more of a grown-up commentator than I am, should be fearful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Huge thanks to Michael Crick. Now, next week, I'll be talking to the man who cheerfully punctures our favourite national delusions. Professor Bobby Duffy of King's College London will take us on a brisk, civilised tour through what Britain thinks it knows and what it actually doesn't. This podcast is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.